There's a new scariant on the loose, Sam. I thought, how can we possibly record this episode when there's so much to worry about?
Well, Dan, as you speak, I'm going to move 6 feet across here because I think it's not safe.
Hang on.
Okay.
Oh, no, the screen isn't mirrored. Let me go. Yeah.
So, yeah, Clown World coming back into full effect. And just a good time to galvanize ourselves and joking aside, get moving, because we can see that things are ramping up again. And we knew this wasn't gone away in terms of narrative, but we're starting to see the rumblings again, Dan.
Definitely, and I know we're not going to go into like the whole COVID narrative and stories on this episode, but it's being aware of the patterns that are being institutionalized and centralized and globalized. Because I've got a very global set of social media accounts. Probably all of us have, and I follow people from different continents. That it was a great way to keep up to date with what was happening around the world during the height of the kind of hysteria. And I was getting, as many have now seen in the compilation videos, you see the same stories playing out in different countries, even if they're not actually, they're using the same language even. It's totally in lockstep. So already some of this hysteria is now happening across continents. So we know we have to stand on our guard at the door of our mind. But it's an ever important reminder, Sam, as we've been talking about in recent episodes, that we've really got to start taking charge of our own destiny. We've got to start thinking about how we can decentralize in our own lives, and figure out how these moves are going to help to decentralize the system as a whole. Because lo and behold, here we are again talking about another scariant. The reality is, if you look at this time last year, interestingly, some of the same mechanics played out then. There's a new product available, and this product, by the way, is probably not going to sell itself very well anymore now after all the bad news about that product. So what do we need? We need a little bit more fear in the market. And that fear will obviously, despite people's faculties of like having lived their lives for some time now, will go straight, clambering back in line to comply with the directives. So we've got to really take stock now. This is an awakening. This is not an awakening. It's a wake up call.
Yeah.
That we've got to be vigilant. We've got to be vigilant, but we've also, as we've talked about, and I'm ranting here, Sam, but through that vigilance, we haven't got to become kind of like hyper vigilant or hyper aware, where we actually therefore become destabilized to the point we don't act. Like now is actually a time to take what's happening, to notice it, and then come back to ourselves and say, okay, what do I do now? And what can we do now?
100%, Dan. And we're most people on their journey will be further on in their thinking, well, hopefully, than they were in 2020 when that all kicked off first time. So there's probably less need to get into the weeds of it. Of course, it's always interesting to dissect that, but we've talked that down. Where's our energy now? We want to be continuing to evolve, continuing to put things in motion, because I've always said the tricksters will keep playing their tricks. And yes, we're aware of them and we're vigilant, but we're not in awe or kind of, beholden to those narratives and giving our energy to it, dissecting it, because a lot of it's very obvious. And I've talked about timings, Dan, with September coming up. Often you see these things ramp up in September. It is the beginning of the new literal programming, the new school year. You see the TV schedules begin in September. It is setting the tone for the coming year, which is why you often see big things happen in September. So we're aware of all that. We don't need to be sucked in too much energetically. What we need to do is continue evolving on our own roadmap. And I suppose, bring back that urgency if your urgency had waned a little bit. And I don't mean that in a fear urgency way, Dan. I just mean in a continuing to progress and understand that decentralizing does leave us much less at the whims of centralized corporations and states. And therefore, that's all positive moves to make, regardless of how the minutiae of the future narrative plays out from the trickster's point of view. So it's kind of like, there are certain steps to take that we know are beneficial regardless of how that plays out there. And being too tied in with how exactly it's going to play out, no one knows. Same as talking about financial reset. You don't know exactly, but you do know steps that are going to improve your position. So making them is well worthwhile, however it plays out. And you're free from trying to work that out and trying to get to the bottom of a bottomless rabbit hole that probably doesn't even have a bottom, and come up and look back into the light, look around, see what's going on, see what you can do, in your own garden, in your own neighborhood, in your own community, with your contacts online, and really start building those structures and networks.
Yeah, that's the thing about rabbit holes. And I said this at the recent talk that I gave down in the south of England, in Petersfield. is that the thing about rabbit holes is that the further you burrow, the darker it becomes. Like, you can take that literally and metaphorically. And, you know, we often talk about the paradoxes and the dualities and the non-dualities of life. And sometimes, you know, having to see the dark will enable you to see the light. And there's all those dimensions as well. But ultimately, as you were speaking, Sam, I was reminded the quote where, you know, where attention goes, energy flows, or where focus goes, energy flows. And if we're only ever paying attention to what's wrong in the world, well, you know, for those who've subscribed to the law of attraction, we tend to attract more of it. And actually, there's logic to that as well, because if we do end up in this kind of paralyzed state of observance and witnessing, and all we do is focus on what's going wrong in the world, then we don't actually get into action and do anything. And I had some lovely feedback about one of our latest episodes, Sam. We've had some brilliant feedback, and thanks to our viewers who are commenting and engaging and sharing. It's really important. It helps us to understand, you know, how this content is landing and how it's resonating. But one of the viewers said that, you know, the best work that I personally did was when I was challenging the narratives during COVID. And I know there's probably many people would agree with that. But at the same time, now that I've seen the depths of some of these problems, and I have been down some of those rabbit holes and come back up, I'm like, do I really need to keep peering back down there to see the same problem over and over again? Do I really need to keep repeatedly seeing it in different iterations? Because when you get a sense of clarity around what really is underlying what we're facing now, then I'm just drawn back to my kind of entrepreneurial, innovative self and think, what can we do? Like, what can I do? What can we do? And what can I do? And those are the two questions I ask myself. So I'm due to go on a holiday tomorrow after we record this. And I can't wait just to reflect now and think about what's the best use of my time so that I live a fulfilling, joyful life, which is hard when you're stuck down in the rabbit holes. But how can I contribute to the change that I wish to see in the world? That's really where my attention is. And that may be that I still continue to do some questioning of narratives. I think it's important that we have that dimension within all of us, in fact, critical thinking. But if that's all we do, then, well, nothing will really change and the machine will roll on. And meanwhile, nothing else will emerge. So I'm excited to get into this conversation around what some of the things we can do. And we set out to talk a little bit about counter economics today, Sam. But before we get into that, is there anything else you'd like to reflect or add in terms of our opening in this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to get stuck in outrage, and it's understandable, Dan. And you know, you said it before we came on air there that you've been in that amazing energy of co-creation at Camp Out and explorative discussions, and then this morning, you know, you'd logged onto Twitter
for the first time in 10 days.
For the first time in 10 days, and that's a visceral contrast.
Yeah.
And it shows, you know, trying to strike that balance of being vigilant and aware, but also not stuck in outrage if it takes your energy away from the productive stuff you do. And we'll move on from it, Dan, but, you know, I saw one tweet, you know, just linked in an article, and I'm going to read out, just 'cause it shows the comedy, and then we can move on.
Yes.
We literally can move on. So,
or we can keep bringing the comedy because it is important to laugh.
Well, it's comedy because, because I think this was part of, it was I think it was highlighted one of the mainstream papers in the UK, but it was a tweet they sort of highlighted, you know, from a lady called Trisha Greenhalgh. I think she's a scientist. And she said, my various science WhatsApp groups are buzzing. Genetic lineage clips and diagrams flying back and forth. And here's the best line. I understand little of the detail, but it looks like it's once again time to mask up. And that just sums up the clown world. Because even the scientist who's in these groups has said, I'm just seeing all this data flying around. I don't know what any of it means, but I'm just going to go with this line, time to mask up everybody. I mean, that is clown world in a nutshell for me. And that's why I'm so pleased to come back and say, you know, let's just get back on our own road. That's not going to stop happening. And I think so many of the narratives, Dan, they're rehashes again. So you did incredible work demystifying a lot of those narratives in the early days. And I'm sure you're going to do more, but so much of it has been seen.
Yes.
And, you know, we're going over stuff and it's very predictable in a certain way. So I think it's really critical, like you said, that we can be moving forward, bringing more value and not getting stuck in that outrage. Because in a sense, I always think the screen reality is almost there designed to keep you in outrage.
Yeah.
And almost whatever side of the fence you're on, it wants your energy. You know, it's kind of like a theatre show playing out. Again, lots of real things in the theatre show included, but you know, that theatre show only really stops when you turn around and walk out the theatre. As long as you're in there cheering for, you know, certain characters or beholden to what's going on there, you're still in the theatre show, largely your energy. Once you're outside, as you found, Dan, your Twitter was listing, what's around me? What's going on? What can I do? How can I help, you know, improve these situations for myself, my family, my community, and wider projects? And that's where the richness is. And I think that is the thing that is less policeable, by the powers that be, because you're just getting on quietly at a consistent level. So that's why I want to bring that. Let's leave that Twitter stuff behind today, and let's look at again at solutions and where we want to go from here.
There's so much to unravel, and it's so important, Sam. And I'm sure, and please do let us know in the comments what you're feeling as we talk about this, because that outrage I felt this morning is, Sam sent me a message today saying, what's our core focus for today's episode? What would you like to cover? And I was like, I won't say it out loud so that the kids are watching, but like, screw the system, using an F word instead. And that's like, that's how I'm feeling right now.
Yeah.
And that had resulted from 10 minutes on Twitter. And Twitter, my Twitter right now is just curated by all of the people I follow who largely have been critical of the COVID narratives. I do also follow quite a number of people who are pro-narrative, deliberately, because I want to understand the richness of the perspectives. They're the ones that usually trigger me the most, particularly when I see quotes like you've just shared, Sam. And in fairness to the lady, Trish, whoever, she's probably just part of the machinery. And there is another dynamic to that story, which is important to recognize, is that when people feel a deep sense of uncertainty and fear, they resort to the nearest available authority or nearest available mechanism to feel safe again.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that there isn't a level of orchestration that's driving all of these things. There's definitely a bigger picture. There's definitely a trajectory that is commercially driven and control driven within this, I would say, with a high degree of confidence, but not absolute certainty. I try not to deal in absolutes. But either way, we have to recognize that this state of fear, the paradigm that we're in, the fear-based paradigm, is going to keep leaving people resulting in fear-based behaviors.
Yeah.
So whether that's control-based behaviors, like how do we control the external invisible threats so that I feel safe again, or in the case of the counterculture or the movement against that stuff, is we stay in outrage. Like this morning, it immediately put me straight back into fight the system.
Yep.
Into resistance, into activism, and all of that is important. It's important. There has to be some pushback. But having had that 10 days out looking at Camp Out, which was all about, every conversation was really forward-facing, solution-orientated, very positive, very different energy. And actually it's, both energies are actually addictive in a way.
They are.
It's trying to find the balance so that we can actually navigate the yin and yang of it all, but don't get stuck too far in each one, because we become blind. Because if you get too stuck in the kind of, we were talking about this before we came online, if you get so channeled on the kind of positive solution focus, you can end up in this utopian, and there's lots of like hopium, as you call it, Sam, I love that term, and almost like utopian thinking that is then also not grounded in rational practicality. And so there's risks either way. They're both important. But that outrage, and I look back over the last 12 months, like it is like an addiction. You go back for more of the outrage, and that's why that type of content goes viral, because it triggers that in us. We feel that almost like magnetic pull in ourselves. People need to know about this, and that's why it goes viral. That's why people share it. But if that's all we do, then all we will do is be more and more outraged, and all we'll do is like wave our pitchforks at the government, expecting things to change. And sometimes it'll change things, other times we won't. But if we don't then step out of that energy and into something creative, because creative energy doesn't usually flow from that outrage. It actually comes from a blissful, joyful state. The best creativity maybe is stimulated initially by the anger and the frustration and the rage, but actually the best creative work comes when you're in that flow state, which is very difficult to attain.
Totally down. So use it as a catalyst rather than somewhere to get stuck in. It was important. I think back myself, the resistance and the activism on the streets was really important, certainly early on, and showing that presence. I continued going to lots of events in London, not because I ever believed you're going to overthrow the power structure, but also believed it's important to show that. And also it showed to a lot of people who weren't seeing other narrative. Some of the most emotional times I had, Dan, were walking through areas of London where people come into housing going, I didn't know there were people who were against this, and I'd been lied to. They told me they weren't. Everyone was on board. So it had a visceral, really important role, and those things have a role, but it's not being caught in them.
Yes.
And obviously in a longer term, obviously we've both been in both kind of events of resistance and activism, and also building events, and both have had their place. But the most sort of joy and creativity I've got is certainly recently has come from going to events that have been built. You know, they've been a reaction, but they've actually built things and brought people together. And I think, you know, we talked about even reaching more people. How do you? A lot of people are aware of the issues, but you know, feel powerless, or they feel in kind of apathy. And if you've built solutions that actually are an example or something to go to, if you're saying, well, actually, there's another way, and here it is, look at it. That's much more interesting to most people than just you telling them about the outrage and saying, come and join me in the outrage. Neither of us know what to do. We haven't got anything else to go to. That's not a very juicy proposition for people. Now, a lot of us have been called to be in that place regardless. We couldn't ignore that. But for the people who still feel, whatever reason, able to kind of compartmentalize it, if you've got nothing better to say, well, hang on, there's other ways we can do things. This is great. And as I've said, Dan, a lot of the fundamental things, you know, is where we can reach that. I think it's Rob Verkerk used that term, the movable middle.
Yeah.
You know, who absolutely do respond to better locally grown food, organic. That's not conspiracy stuff. I mean, that's not stuff that's going to be too far down a rabbit hole. Most people would understand that level and want to come across to, you know, better ways of healthier living, you know, localized. And so building structure around that has actually not just the power to support, you know, the networks you're already in, but actually to attract more people to question the bigger centralized narratives and actually come across. So it's powerful in both ways. So it is activism as well, isn't it, Dan?
It definitely is.
It's activism in its own form, and it has direct positive consequences. And over the longer term, actually is grassroots improvement that will interest other people.
Definitely. I mean, during the course of my activist journey in the last 3 years, having gone from, I've always been someone who's politically aware, but probably not politically active. You know, there's things that have triggered me or caused me outrage in the past, but I've never taken to the streets to vent it. You know, COVID was something different. It was so far from, you know, I pride myself on a level of integrity, and what I was witnessing in the outside world was out of integrity, like so far out of it that it was just intolerable. And I was so moved to action by the collateral harm that I was seeing inflicted, particularly on young people, but also the elderly and everyone in between. But those two groups in particular were emotionally troubling to me. And I just felt like I couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore, and I had to do something.
Yeah, likewise, Dan. It was so visceral.
Yeah, but as a result, you know, most people know now that I have a deeply curious mind, and whenever I put my mind to something, I want to learn all about it. You know, this is why we're doing this podcast, because part of your journey of self-exploration as well as external exploration. But I read this book called Blueprint for Revolution during the course of my activism. I was trying to learn through history. You know, what makes, you know, what leads to successful activism, what leads to successful outcomes. And the book is called Blueprint for Revolution by Serda Popovic, who is he's the founder of the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. He was involved in the toppling of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. You know, they effectively toppled a dictator. But this book is called, the subtitle of the book really gives a hint at what the book's about. It's how to use rice pudding, Lego men, and other nonviolent techniques to galvanize communities, overthrow dictators, and simply change the world. Now, the rice pudding and Lego man piece is important because all through the book, he gives these amazing examples of comedy, like actual, like street theater, comedy, stuff that had people, the regular people, the movable middle, laughing, participating. Like they had an inflatable version of like Slobodan Milosevic, and they had like this inflatable hammer that like people were just going like hammering, like hammering in the street, and people would watch and laugh. So there was this element of like joy to the activism. So, you know, it's not just galvanizing the outrage, it's actually transmuting it into something positive and energetically attractive. And, you know, regardless of what you might think about this, he would put the most physically attractive people at the front of the march. So when they would walk through the streets, you know, people's heads would turn just to like the beauty of the physical aesthetics of the people walking by, and people are like, I want to be part of that crowd. You know, so he's very candid about it. Tells the story, you know, rightly or wrongly what you think about that. But either way, they were using methods of attraction to galvanize, as it says, to galvanize communities and to literally overthrow a dictator in their case. So I think it's so important that even in the resistance and the activisms, we find ways to make it appealing and attractive, because it's not very comfortable to just join part of a party with like a sack full of woe, like, and pain. But gatherings of people who are in that sense of outrage is actually cathartic.
Yeah.
And it also, it is a way of shared sense making to rationalize, like, is it right that I'm feeling this way? Like, because there is an element of that, of, am I alone in thinking this is wrong? And calibrating that with other people is actually a very powerful part of the process. So there is merit to all of that, but then it's like, how does that turn into action, both in a resistance and also in a rebuilding sense? Because the big question people are asking now is, what can I do? You know, we may now go through a period of resistance again because of what's emerging, but ultimately, if that's all we do, we're just fighting back the progress of the existing system and not laying a pathway of our own. And Sam, you know, I think people are looking for like the utopian magic bullet, like the single solution that's going to fix it or save save the world or save the people. And I think that's wishful thinking on steroids, and also dangerous thinking, because it leads to utopianism. And you shared another story about what Rob Verkerk said at Campo, if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Well, yeah, I think it just, he was seeing, you know, some people sort of being very much, we need to pull down the current medical system and replace it. You know, he was very, again, it's that what I view as a realistic line, not the hopium of we're not ready.
Yeah.
You know, that we're building, and that's great, and it's improving and trying to get more people on board and shift beliefs. And you said it, we talked about it also, Dan, before we came on, about certain aspects of common law, which can be technically right and very and correct, but if the majority don't, you know, aren't in that structure and don't believe it, it doesn't function as perhaps it should. So understand the realities of these ideas, even if they are technically right or technically correct, or even from a, you know, common law perspective in line with, you know, natural law and all these things, this is where I come, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work where we are right now with what we're dealing with. And I think those, although sometimes people don't want to hear that, I think it's really important, because that's being real, that's seeing what we're facing. And I think, you know, that story resonated really well with what you talked about there, about the, you know, using realistic tactics to garner, you know, support for certain movements. That's real. You know, rather than being just in the sort of hopium idea of just do this, it's right and it will work. So I think it's really interesting to look at those realities. And again, I think people can shy away from them because they're not as simple. It's not as easy. It's a simple idea of rail against that, demand that go, but actually the real work is long-term work.
Yes.
And look at it. And I think coming back to, you know, why the COVID narrative is so powerful and why I think they're going to use it again, and we see those signs appearing, is that it peaks the real fear one, which is the fear is the mind killer. So it switches off rational thinking, the people who are still scared, who do believe the narratives. Whereas there are topics that we can reach many more people on, potentially, like the financial system, you know, like food and like decentralization, that don't have those same things built into them. They affect everybody, but it doesn't shut them off. So, I think there is more traction in certain areas you can get. There is, of course, traction you get on the COVID narrative and the freedoms, but the reason I think it's so powerful is that it does, if people are in fear, they've literally going, like that was it, just time to mask up. You know, there's no time to look at the nuances of all those discussions and look at the reality. If you're in fear, even if you've got doubts, well, it's not worth having that. It's not worth even being over those doubts. Just take, you know, what's been advised, mask up. So that's why it's so powerful. But there are many things we can look at that are on the kind of, you know, the movable middle, as Rob briefly calls it, that are accessible, and there are far more discussions happening than I think even the social media or the algorithms, you know, lend us to believe potentially. We talked about in another episode, Dan, where I think part of that almost division is actually ramped up and looks like it's more divided than it actually is in the street. But that takes work to get the conversations going, like we had at Camp Out, get those conversations going.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I've been enjoying my new gym in Bournemouth since we moved here, and I hear locker room conversations about it quite genuinely. And even I was walking to I was going to a football match the other day, and on the way to the stadium, I heard a group of guys just talking about like how ridiculous it was that everyone was wearing masks. It's like they didn't, you know, I get a sense that they were never at any of the protests. You know, I just got a sense of it. I could be wrong. You know, careful not to judge people, but that conversation is now more and more commonplace. But there are those, you know, they're not necessarily tweeting away or like in the comments on social media, you know, because we've seen all the social constructs around these things. That means that the group dynamics play out, and you don't want to be seen to be disrupting the apple cart because you get judged by your peers. Like all of these things become barriers. They become unconscious self-censorship, which is a massive problem in itself, which is why the movable middle in some ways are a silent majority. It's a silent majority. But I think you're absolutely right, even to use Rob Verkerk as an example as well. He's not just about, he's behind the Alliance for Natural Health. And he doesn't just look at the physical health. He doesn't just look at, things like nutrition and well-being. He looks actually all the environmental factors as well. So he's put out a paper in the US where he's currently also CEO of the international department. And it was about environmental pollutants, particularly with water, in tap water, and the harms that was creating on human health. And it's blown up in the mainstream media. So it's all over the mainstream media. Apparently it's even made its way to the White House. So now people are talking about the Alliance for Natural Health and Rob Verkerk in a very positive sense around this subject that is not connected directly to COVID narrative. And it's a gateway then, because they see him as a credible authority, if not the credible authority, because the paper they put together is so strong, that undoubtedly they'll then see his other work and eventually say, well, if he's right on that, then why would he be so wrong on that? So it's actually a gateway.
It is. That's beautifully put down. It is a gateway. And, and I think you have to be realistic again. I could meet people where they're sometimes going full rabbit hole, something where it's just going to be a turnoff. And the problem is you can be right about what you're saying, but the fact is to go there straight away is not going to work. You need to be reaching people and having good dialogues that then can evolve. And like you said, that's Rob's work way in there. That's where I come back to, Dan, trying to find consensus amongst any community, is just not is I'd argue not really feasible because of our uniqueness. And you don't need it if you're just looking at the real kind of what Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the kind of real foundational stuff that most people would have consensus that they need improving.
Yes.
Doesn't mean they're going to consensus exactly how to do that. But getting those dialogues about those things that do need improving is a way of reaching more people and getting more people in dialogue. And those dialogues will naturally lead to more decentralization, questioning what's happening in big corporations with too much state intervention. And it is absolutely a way in rather than coming in just hardcore on a certain line. And I know that's hard because I sometimes have to feel like I'm, not censoring myself, but almost trying to meet someone there and see, what can be relatable? Where's the middle ground between us to discuss things? And that's not, I don't view that as me as I will never, my take is, I'll never back the lies. I won't go and agree with things I don't agree with, because that to me is supporting certain things that I view as lies and psyops. I will never, to keep the peace, say, yes, but I will quietly say, well, I don't agree with that and I've got another view, but I'm not chasing, saying this is how it is and this is the way. And so that's the line I've tried to find over many years of, being aware of lots of these things, Dan, is, of not chasing because it feels like an attack.
Yes, it does.
And if people feel like they're being attacked, then immediately the shutters come up. It's kind of a visceral response. And interesting, you going back to what you said about that book and his talk about protests, one of the most best responses I ever had when I was in London, Dan, I used to do the odd bit of megaphone stuff. And the best reactions I used to have actually was when I was doing a sort of comedic stuff where I was just kind of doing a pastiche and taking it even further, showing how ridiculous the measures were, but actually just even caricaturing it if that's possible, because he didn't even need caricaturing, but caricaturing it even a little bit further. And what I saw there was so many more people reacting, people smiling behind masks, people, because they know a lot of them it's nonsense, but like you said, they don't feel able to, or to speak out, or to not fit in. But that was getting through to them, and there was a kind of inner knowing of, yes, this is ridiculous, and that was a way in using kind of comedy, and that wasn't attacking them. So it wasn't a feeling of there's a guy ranting on a megaphone, I'm going to walk away and turn off. There's a guy just kind of having fun, but showing the ridiculousness, and there is a power to that, I think, as well. So it's another way of coming in where you are showing the nonsense, but you're not attacking anybody either, and it's a fine line.
It is a fine line, and it's ultimately a marketplace of ideas. And in any marketplace, there are buyers and sellers. But the reality is, in a marketplace, people, when they prefer to buy rather than to be sold to. That's the key difference. You'll go into a shop, particularly in Britain here. If we go into a shop, the moment the shop attendant comes up to you, you're like, "No, thanks, I'm all right." Do you need anything? No.
Yeah,
I'm actually.
You always preempted it. You feel them coming, like you're right. I'm ready to say no. Leave me alone.
Yeah, no, I'm all right. Yes. but we don't like to be sold to. And that the thing is, it's no different in the marketplace of ideas. Is that people like to buy their own perspectives, even if they do it unconsciously. So if we're trying to impart our view on someone else, we're effectively selling our idea and expecting people to buy it. So sales is about creating the conditions for someone to buy, which means, building rapport. The comedy might do that. You're right. You don't have to agree with someone else's view, but actually acknowledging that they have a perspective, even if you think it's invalid, at least acknowledging that they've come to something, whether it's by themselves or by, coercion, at least recognizing that they have their own views, because it's important to do that if you're then to have sovereignty over your own. And then, for me, it's about asking questions and understanding how people got to certain perspectives. It's the classic Covey, seek first to understand before being understood. And that way, often it creates the opportunity to then impart your own view in a much more relaxed setting. But if it's at loggerheads and you attack and defend, buy and sell, then it's very tricky.
And I don't. I mean, we've all been there.
Totally.
I'm not criticizing anybody who has had a rant. I've had lots of rants.
I've had plenty of rants.
And of course, because we were pushed so far, and it was so, like you said, the reaction was so guttural and so important, and the urgency of it, Dan, and then seeing the harms, that's why it did push us to be maybe ranty when we didn't want to be, because there was such an urgency. And what we're seeing was so upsetting and so, yes, well, all those words. I mean, it was so powerful that understandably that brought out their action. So I'm not obviously not against that, and I'm saying I've been there as well. But I'm just trying to look at now how can I navigate, how can I bring solutions to more people and get there, and what can we learn from where we've been, and like you said, Dan, almost with this COVID narrative pitching around me up, learning from where we are rather than just beginning again.
Yes.
So it's building on what we've learned, building on what we've seen, experienced, and seeing, we don't need to do, from a reaction point of view, the same thing we've done before ad nauseum, and almost get into our own, right, okay, it's time to do that. Let's keep evolving. And that's the whole process of this journey is evolution, isn't it?
Yeah, that said, as I look on my social media from my post earlier today, and this is the challenge as well, because in a dialogue between two people, it's different. You can build rapport, but people don't make the distinction online. It's like when you make a post on social media, some people will take it personally. It's like some people read it as though you've written it for them. And, I perhaps haven't learned from my ways here, because today's post, where hands up who will not be indulging in any of the probable COVID hysteria this winter. Now, there are some people who have engaged in the COVID hysteria or read that and go, screw you, Dan, and they'll judge me, unfollow me, delete me, or go into rage in the comments. So we have to be mindful on social media. People take single-way communication as two-way communication.
Yeah.
And that's how we create triggers. I mean, that's a triggering post. I mean, it's got lots of support, of course, because I've attracted a lot of people who feel the same way as I do. But ultimately, really, that's not going to build any bridges. For some who are on the borderline, they may actually, no, Dan, this time around, no, I'm not jumping on that merry-go-round.
Yeah.
But for others, they say, well, actually, if this thing does come, I'm going to be, will be.
And I've experienced myself, Dan, and I said that, when you're having those dialogues, like at Camp Out or the other talks I give, it very rarely, I mean, I've not experienced it where it gets, that kind of argumentative, because actually there's always a dialogue going on.
Yes.
But as we've talked, some people get triggered by the word crypto on a poster for talk and come in hard with all these certain views. They've not even heard what I've said about it. They've just seen the word crypto. So and that's how can we harness these dialogues and not get stuck in, short form, little bursts, which don't have the context, don't have the, respond and reply and well, let's look at it this way. And that's what's so difficult. And that's why it can be so polarizing online, which is why we need to get more conversations going.
Yes, definitely. Yes, important. Yeah. And that's why, some of the gatherings that we've been to, both you and I, in recent weeks have been very important. It's a stimulus to that conversation, but it does enable us then to get into a different context. If the event is set up to think differently about the situation, to look at solutions, to bring diverse perspectives together, then it does create an expansive level of thinking that enables us to get out of that kind of outrage culture There may be elements, and I've been to events that are all about outrage. It's all talks that are in like the energy of the presenter is still in like rage, and there is a place for that. There is a time and place for that. But coming full circle, really, it's asking what can we do, and we've gone on an expansive discussion of what's going on right now. But part of what we wanted to talk about is counter economics. But I'll introduce it, but perhaps we'll just touch on it really because it just hints at some of the solutions. Now, the reason I wanted to bring counter economics to the table, and I'll define it first, and I'll read this because it's on my notes here, but it's counter economics is a concept introduced by libertarian philosopher Samuel Edward Konkin III, cool name. It refers to a theoretical framework and practice that involves engaging in economic activities outside of and often in opposition to the traditional state-regulated or government-sanctioned economic system. The goal of counter-economics is to minimize or undermine the control and influence of the state over economic interactions and transactions. And I think most of us would resonate with the sentiments of counter-economics in the current situation that we find ourselves in. So I've done quite a bit of research around this subject. And through conversations with people like John Bush, who I had on my previous show, and you and I have seen some of his webinars recently, they've been talking in the US about counter-economics for a long time, and they've been using it around the concept of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as a way for people to transact effectively outside of the system.
Yep.
Now, you and I, Sam, have talked at length on this show at various points with a very practical and realistic view about the probable likelihood of that continuing in its current form. In the absence of regulatory pressures right now, people can freely trade using these digital assets and currencies, free from state interaction to a degree. And even now, like the questions are being asked about taxation and capital gains and all these different things that are coming forward, what I call the above the ground problems, which are like the current economic system, the current legal system, because even though blockchain and crypto can't technically be muted, it's immutable. You can mute it pretty strongly by putting a really strong legal flag in the ground saying, if you guys do that, we're going to be putting you in jail. So the technology might not be silenced, but that's the problem with a legal system, is that, again, it's a belief system in a way, even though it's written in, legislation and law, it's people generally want to abide by the law. But either way, right now, we're in this gray area, and counter economics tends to find its way into gray spaces where it's neither black and white. And creates a space for people to do things differently. So I wanted to touch upon some of these things because the idea of a counter economy in this sense, a lot of people are seeking it, but they're rejecting crypto because of the fears that it's going to result in central bank digital currencies, which again, we've talked about extensively, and fears that be regulated. But it's like this little period in history right now, we can freely transact peer-to-peer using these tools.
Absolutely, Dan. And it comes back to the fears and the what ifs can sometimes stop people actually using and benefiting tools that exist now absolutely are functioning. So we've seen it, and I know people firsthand, Dan, who over this past 3 years have been able to do great work, build solutions, help people with healing products, with education, and they would not have been able to do that without using Bitcoin.
Yes.
Because they've been debanked. Okay, and that is the centralized nature of the banking system, which is if you're debanked, then literally out of the mainstream legacy bank system, you're locked out. But then a lot of these, payment providers like Stripe, PayPal, also getting on people and saying you can't use our service. So we've seen that happen to people, and yet they've been able to continue their projects, helping people, using Bitcoin. That can't be stopped because it's decentralized. So these ideas that also, well, what if this in the future? Well, if that person had said, well, I'm not going to bother because what if in the future, that would have stopped them having 3 years of successfully helping people and building, communities and solutions, and some getting healing products to certain people and being able to function. So all those items, what ifs, I just say, well, I'm watching that happen. And I always talk about the Russian story. I won't do it again, but, I had this, contact who was in Russia, who was able to use, crypto to trade outside borders because they had been shut out of the SWIFT system. The banks were down when it kicked off with Ukraine. He didn't have access to the funds in the legacy system, yet he was able to use that to his advantage and trade peer-to-peer to buy a car and leave the country. So not only are these things been happening, they are continue to happen, and they will be able to continue to happen. It may get harder at times, there may be changes, but I always come back to the example, Dan, of when people just talk about legislation. Well, under legislation in 2020, we weren't allowed to meet up. Well, there were creative people who met up, and had the best meetups they've ever had, and built communities, and built really great solutions based on meeting up against the say-so of the legislation of the time. Now, a lot of people, that legislation has been viewed, even in the mainstream, to be not lawful and to be challenged, and a lot of the fines never stood. So, again, it just shows that defeatist attitude of I'm not going to explore anything because of what the tricksters may do or what the state may do is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because it means you're not making evolution. Now, if you're on the path of using things, then it doesn't have to be the end game, but you've got an extra skill, you've got an extra tool, you used it, you may be able to pivot more. It may lead to other solutions, and I think you're on that learning path of evolving. So I think that's always my call to people, rather than getting caught on, we always talk about, Dan, that people just pick out there's one issue with it, with a potential thing that's a tool solution. Well, yeah, there are issues with everything.
Yes.
But actually, that's not going to stop me using it as a tool that's really, has tangible use case and benefit in the foreseeable future. And Bitcoin is like that. And I think understanding that absolutely, when you understand the technology, that you can't shut down Bitcoin. Yes, you can bring all legislation like these, like you said, Dan, these other layers, but that's as they brought in other layers on whether you can meet your neighbor or hug your mum. Now, we got past those layers. I didn't stop hugging my mum, and because I knew what was right to do. Therefore, certain legislation may come in, but equally, if more people are using that, then it becomes hard to police. And this is where grassroots action really is important, because, a lot of it is policed just by ideas or stopping people even going down the road to look at it. That's policing in its own effect, isn't it, Dan?
Yes,
policing through fear of don't bother because you won't be allowed to, or you won't be, actually get busy doing those things. And a lot of those grassroots things cannot be controlled, because I always say this, there aren't millions of stormtroopers on the street saying you're not allowed to get that veg from your friend because it hasn't gone through the the FDA or the EU's analysis of food safety. That isn't something that's very policeable. That's something you can go and do. Same as getting some Bitcoin within your community, maybe learning to trade within that, or get some other coins and understanding how that works. Now, understanding how that works and playing around with it gives you another skill set, gives you another tool, gives you another angle that you can then maybe build on in the future. You don't have to end game it now. And I think that's where people can be paralyzed, Dan, is thinking, I want to walk into, just like Rob Kurtz's line, walk into a completely new system, show me it, and I'll go there and there's no problems with it, it's done. Life isn't like that.
No.
But if we can be building little pods and little extra tools and learn how to use them, and we may find that actually that helps us build something more in the future or expand that network. So that's what I advocate for, Dan, is, and you said it at the last podcast, steps.
Yes.
Steps towards doing that. And particularly when we talk about finance, you don't have to be like mad into crypto and understand what's going on in space, because it's bottomless, like all these rabbit holes. There's another bottomless one. But just having a form of digital payment that's outside the system, outside the legacy system, where you're outside of jurisdiction, you're outside of your identity. It's just a wallet, address from it peer-to-peer, and there's no third-party intermediary, state, centralized, policing that transaction. And the people who are educated about that see the power. But when you understand it, it's a great tool to have in your locker for future scenarios.
Yes, and it's not the only tool, and we'll talk about some more examples in a minute. But Derek Brose, who was on my show last week, who worked with John Bush on the Freedom Cell network, building these localized communities. If you don't know about Freedom Cells, check them out. I think it's freedomcells.org. You'll have to check that. Let me just check that out. Freedomcells.org. Really interesting localized communities. But Derek entirely transacts outside of the system. He only accepts and pays with Bitcoin and Monero. Like, I bought 2 of his books at the Better Way conference where I met him, and he only took. Yeah. He has no bank accounts. He only has Bitcoin now. He's put all his assets into digital systems, and that's how he transacts. Now, there is risks attached with that, many risks, but it's a choice. And he and many of the communities that he's worked with in the US and Mexico, where he spends all the time, they're transacting purely in these digital currencies. So they've created entire counter economics, everything. But, in addition to things like bartering, they do bartering, they do time sharing and or time banking. These are other concepts, but they do come with complexities. But there's also, I've come across communities who've developed their own currencies, physical currencies. It doesn't have to be digital. If you're worried about that, there are people who've created their own pound. They also come with problems. The Bristol pound is often cited, but I've seen a working paper which sounds an awful lot like social credit systems.
Yeah.
We're going to incent and give you extra rewards for spending on good things.
Yeah.
And that all ends up very tricky.
Yeah. Within a 15-minute city. Maybe.
Yeah, within a 15-minute city, it
With
all
a
starts to look funky.
Totally.
Like, who determines what's the greater good? The moment you go down the abstract sense of greater good, like as you said, Sam, like getting consensus on those things is very difficult, and most people don't think about the second order consequences of their actions. But you've got bartering, trading, community current systems, time banking, even things like ride sharing and carpooling are effectively a form of carpool of counter economics, because you're reducing the amount of taxation that is paid. Like all these things, use less vehicles. That's not part. I'm not promoting the 15-minute city agenda, but I'm showing that actually reducing your ability to the need to pay certain forms of tax.
Yeah.
Sharing assets, peer-to-peer marketplaces, even the freelance gig economy is bit of that loose tear my throat there. Shame I got off the coffee, Sam.
It's one of the risks, mate. But I'm glad, that's the risk of loose tea. But also, I'm glad you said risk, Dan, because it's almost as soon as people want to make a move, they go, "There's a risk in it." Well, how risky is it to just stay in the legacy system?
Yes,
because that's the point. It's also like, well, I feel a bit risky moving any of my assets into crypto. Well, do you feel comfortable leaving all your asset wealth in a legacy state-controlled system? So that's the issue. There are risks with everything, but if you spread that risk and actually see the benefits to that, and there is no safe haven panacea anywhere, but they're all, you learn new skills and you've got more tools. So trying to find, I think people, when I talk to me about the financial reset, want to hedge it. They almost want to go, just give me the safe. Where do I move to that? Well, everything's got risk in it here, but life's got risks in it, and we need to embrace those risks. But there are greater rewards from taking creative, risks and embracing those. There's remember Alan Watts' book, The Wisdom of Insecurity. Embracing that insecurity. The idea of looking for most security is a living death, really.
Yes.
So I think that's the point. Is that, and that's where I love financial education, when people feel it feels so risky moving to Bitcoin, and then I try and educate them what the risks are of sitting in fiat currency, purely, and it's a different conversation once you understand that risk, and that's where the light bulb can go off. That's where education about certain things you think are safe, but actually they're not. I think that's, and again, perceived safety, Dan.
Yes.
They get to perceive risk, and again, maybe through education, your perception will actually change.
Well, part of the problem is actually the very culture where we're trying to minimize or eliminate risk. Like that is part of the problem. That is exactly like we want it, like zero COVID, net zero, all of these things, like zeroing in, like removing all trace of the problem. But by doing so, like it creates massive secondary risks elsewhere, massive collateral harms, like all of these things. Like this idea that we can minimize or eliminate risk is part of the problem.
Well, zero risk to me equals zero life.
Yeah.
Basically, life inherently is a risk, and that's what's so amazing about it. And if you had zero risk, then it is a living death.
Yes. So, we've got to catch ourselves when we're looking to, it makes sense. You don't always go maximum risk, max return, like that's just, it's adrenaline seeking. If you want a bit of that in your life, sometimes it's good to have a bit of that, but if that's all you do, you'll burn out or crash or die. Either way,
and personal choice in it, then. That's coming back to it, that is in tune with you. And, you talk about adrenaline. I saw that shift in my life in the Alps, where it became more and more, that's where I found my freedom, big mountain skiing. And it became very much more, and again, people think, none of us wore helmets back in the day. Now a lot of people just think you have to, and that's what you must do. And they almost want to say you're not allowed to go on the slopes without it, against personal choice. And again, this kind of zero risk, or what if. Well, we were fine for years. And what's so interesting in my experience, I saw people who had no concerns about it. We knew the risks we were taking the helmet, and yet these same people, their whole view, because of this kind of perception now come in, it was the same person, and they now view their sport as much riskier because of this kind of perception, and the sales of actually helmets, and the companies actually it wasn't really as organic as people wanted it. It got sold to them. And then those people didn't feel as safe as they were before, and felt again, it's just a shift of conditioning, and I suppose I was where I am. Nothing's changed, and I used to get criticised then. I had somebody attack me on social media, said, "Oh, Sam, I can't believe you're skiing with that helmet." Well, we were all skiing the same stuff 15 years ago quite happily, and nothing's changed for me. my way ups, nothing's changed. The helmets existed 15 years ago. I took the choice there. Nothing's changed for me. Yet they'd moved with the kind of societal pressures and the kind of norms. And again, I respect that's your choice. I'm not anti-helmet. I'm just pro-choice. That's as simple. You want to do that, you do. But let's look at and I think that was such an interesting thing. I see that now across the whole of society.
Yeah, there's I forget what book it is now, but it actually breaks down the actual absolute and relative risks of certain activities and how our perception of that risk has been massively amplified by media. Lo and behold, what a surprise.
Yeah.
But people end up trying to mitigate things that aren't actually true risks. And it's not to say that there aren't things that are riskier than others. That's true. It's a sliding scale, and therefore you may take different steps to mitigate against it. But it's the risk culture and the safetyism that comes with it that actually attracts more problems. We actually attract more issues because we're focusing again where attention goes, energy flows. And if only we're ever looking at risk, we're never looking at the upside. We're never looking at the potential opposite of that. And it's so important when we're evaluating different choices that are becoming available to us as we move forward, that we look at it with open mind and look at it, because even things like I often in the communities hear conversations around barter and time banking, time sharing, for instance, and they're both very valid means of exchange. That's what they are, but both of them come with incredible complexities. Barter requires what I would describe as like a double coincidence of wants, which means that if you are to barter an exchange, like person A has to want what person B can give. And of course, digital marketplaces and physical marketplaces can make that exchange easier. But if you're in a purely exchange economy, then you have to have that in cahoots. There's limited scope. It's like a lack of standardization. It's like got geographical constraints. Like you also have like the issue of indivisibility and fractional value. Like if you're exchanging certain things, like how do you characterize what something is worth, and how do you and the same with time sharing or time banking has got different levels of complexity, imbalance of skills, dependency on participation and fulfillment, valuing time differently, misalignment with demand. So if you've got a skill that's actually really specialized, but there's no demand for it, then you're going to be left out of the system because, your skill is less. So that's not to say there isn't practical application, because I know plenty of people who do barter and they do time sharing, and it works beautifully when you find those limited scenarios where it works. But the reality is those two modes of exchange aren't going to rip and replace the overall system. But it is a way that you can begin to decentralize and extract yourself, because if you are, doing time swapping or bartering, then effectively it is counter economics. It is a form of counter economics. It can be a very effective form of counter economics. But if we come into this kind of puritanism that it's like the be all and end all, then we lose sight of the fact that
there is again that the puritanism stops the fact that that's where I view it. I do a bit of all these things. Bit of everything, and experience those and see, and that will grow from there. And I think that idea of pushing, we must do this, we must do that, particularly in this transitional stage, everyone is learning, and by doing more, then we're going to find out the issues you talked about. We've got to go through, and I think that's the other issue with growth is it's not arriving, it's going through, and going like on any journey, like a real healing journey is going through healing crisis. It's not a linear path to just better. It's actually going to be, ups and downs, and it might feel harder at times. And I think that's the point, that there are going to be growing pains to whatever we do. But I don't think, holding out for these panaceas and these solutions that don't have any downsides. I mean, they don't exist, but trying to find those is actually going to stop us moving forward on that path. And you've got to do trial and error.
Yes.
It's like your own. I always come back to these things are fractals in all the different areas, like a health journeys. It has to be trial and error experimentation. Seeing where people are at, seeing where you're at yourself. This is a learning curve for all of us, and I think that's where I come back to my line, sort of settling into it, rather than kind of panicking around, going, "We've got to find the ultimate solution." Let's settle into the journey. We don't know how it's going to play out, but I suppose I feel, as long as I'm improving or trying to make improvements, then I'm on the journey. I haven't just if I've felt like I completely stopped doing everything and it was just an outrage, then I know who's that on. That's on me, and I know I've been caught up by and I've caught up by the theatre. So as long as I'm improving that journey and exploring. And the more of us who are doing that, the more good things will happen over
Yes.
time. That's inevitable over time if we do that.
Definitely. I mean, the kind of opening part of the conversation today is really a rally call to the importance of decentralization, because there's a kind of idea that all of this is, just a single group of people directing the play, and if we get those people out of the way and replace them with others, it's all going to change. And of course, changing personnel right now would actually probably make some sort of help. But actually, going back to the Blueprint for Revolution by Serdar Popovic, that they, by confession, said that they weren't ready. Like, they managed to topple a dictator, but before long, like, they were basically dealing with another dictator. They didn't have a ready-made replacement. They didn't have they didn't have a new system ready to go, and actually they ended up with a lighter form of the existing problem. But
yeah,
we've seen it post-COVID. Some people celebrated some of the kind of tyrannical leaders being moved out of position, almost though we've won. It's like, but no, then they get replaced with someone who's worse.
Yeah,
and it can go either way unless you're ready.
And that can eat up so much time, Dan, can't it? Again, I think that's by design of the hopium of, if they do that. I mean, I think most people have seen enough that, every time the politicians has promised you change, that it hasn't happened. But that's the kind of short-termism they want people on and going, well, just another hope, another hope, another hope. But the one thing they can't control is you make tangible improvements. So rather, and again, I've always said this, if good things happen on the world stage, I will celebrate that. That's great. But I'm not holding out for them, and I'm not waiting for them. And I'm not my well-being and the well-being of, my family, my community, the people around me. I think it's really important that we take that out of their hands as much as we can. Of course, there's an effect of what's happening on a world stage, but the more we can do that, the more we have taken it in our own hands. And it's dangerous to be waiting around on narratives that are so deep, so complex, so obfuscated, that you think you've got an handle on what's going on there. It's so much smoke and mirrors, you literally can't. Therefore, that is a danger to be putting your hope into any leader, even if they're saying all the right things, even if they really seem to be in line with you, whatever. You still have never met them. They're still not, I've always said this, until I saw something tangibly happening in my street or my high street, there was an improvement, then that's all rhetoric. And even with the right people, until I see that, whereas I can see improvements in my local community, I can see people trading with each other, I can see food being grown. Those things are real, tangible. There's no doubt about it, Dan. I think trying to take steps, there's no doubt about of going, well, maybe this is that. We're caught up in that energy that's so outside of ourselves. And that energy can go into things I definitely know are improving my own health, my own well-being, my own decentralized aspects. That's real. And I can literally take that to the bank as real. Somebody's handed you a organic cucumber that hasn't been sprayed with, glyphosate or whatever. Those things are real. The rest, okay, it's all playing out, and we need to be vigilant. But coming back to ourselves and what we can do is so powerful and so rewarding as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we've given some examples through this, different forms of trading, whether you're going to use crypto, Bitcoin, bartering, time sharing, community currencies, whatever it may be. But, participating in the local food communities that are emerging. There's lots of those now, food cooperatives and growing initiatives, choose to buy your supplies from those local suppliers. But even, quite frankly, just shopping locally. You were going to a wedding. Well, by the time this is published, I'll have already been to it. But I needed a shirt for the particular dress code that was put in place. Bohemian wedding, like for coastal wedding. I was like, Bohemian, what is that? So of course I could go online and buy something on Amazon, but no, I wanted to walk up to the high street and have a look what I could get in my local town. And what was beautiful was I went to this independent store, got to talk to the owner, tried on a bunch of things, and ended up talking for about 20 minutes to the local owner about the local community and some of the things that were going on. Learned an awful lot. She actually happens to live on the same road. She knows someone else that we know. And all of a sudden, there was these like dots connecting. It would never have happened if I just gone on Amazon to get a shirt. It'd been easy.
I love that, Dan, because so much more has come out of it than just your initial thing of I'll buy local. Actually, there's a ripple effect that goes much beyond that. Actually, it's going to lead to more conversations. And
yes.
the more, come back to our pro thing, how do we get more conversations? Well, we're going to get more conversations by interacting more with people locally anyway. So there's a knock-on effect from just that action.
Yes.
It's immeasurable. And I think that's the point. You can't belittle that. You can't even quantify it, what that can do, because that extra engagement is what's bringing people together. And again, that's the power of the COVID narrative, to separate people out, both physically and even from meeting up, because that's really where people get discussing and actually can make change, and that's where it's crucial to bring those dialogues back in.
Yeah, it's building bonds with people you wouldn't necessarily normally have bonds with, and it's just the dots start to connect. And ultimately, localization is one of the biggest forms of decentralization. It's removing, the transactions with these global corporates. Retracting the amount of social media time you have, and think about if you actually, you can actually go on your phone now and see how much time you're actually spending on social media. Tot up that time for the week and say, what could you do with that time? It doesn't have to eliminate it. You don't have to go on like a total elimination diet. It's good to stay informed, but how else could you be spending your time? So it's, how can you, the counter economics is, to me, is not just about the economic side. It's about a behavioral, it's an attitudinal behavioral element. But ultimately it's part of the overall move to decentralization, so that we actually start to take power back for ourselves, our own sovereign power, but ultimately start to pull away from the kind of machine that we're currently facing. So, and then tell other people about it, tell other people about the wonderful store that you've just been to, like I've just done. So if you're in Bournemouth, I forget the name of the store, otherwise I'd have given it a shout out. I'll put it in the comments. But it's
because these decentralized networks need our support to flourish. So it goes both ways, isn't it? It's a good step for you, but actually they're going to grow and be more successful if they are being used. Like we talked about, even on some of the digital stuff, there are great Web3 decentralized solutions. Well, they need your support. It's an improvement for you, but also that's going to help them garner more support, more users, create a network effect, and actually get more people involved in supporting those alternatives. So it is a two-way street. It benefits you and it benefits the decentralized network overall. Like those local grown products, or they need you, as you need them, and they need you. And that's how these local economies should be functioning.
Yeah, and also I'm very conscious of that Facebook message I showed you during the broadcast earlier on. Guess what I shared? Daily Mail. It doesn't matter. I mean, the Daily, the Guardian. I think the Guardian is the new word for the establishment, but it doesn't matter what I've shared. I've shared a mainstream publication there, to make a point. But actually, what I should be showing is the new media that's making the same point. So we've got to catch ourselves and think about what are the simple acts that we can undertake in order to start making that change for ourselves and in the world around us. How can we support? Sammy made such an important point, and that's part of the why we're so passionate about educating people about crypto and blockchain Web3, because there are opportunities in there to decentralize, but it will never manifest if we just divert our attention away from it because we're afraid of what it could be or be regulated. The reality is we've got to look at the problems we've currently got and say, well, is it incrementally better than what we currently have? And if so, why don't we support it so we can actually direct it in a way that is much more empowering than where it could go if we leave it to its own devices?
Yeah, and the war on info, the powers that be don't want you to understand solutions and decentralized solutions. Of course they don't, because they want to scare you out of them and keep you comfortable in the world that they control, that because they're about holding on to power. So that's why controlling the narrative around these things is so important to them, because they don't want you to understand. Because as we've talked about, if you understood their financial system, and we're trying to educate about it, you wouldn't feel so happily involved in it, or you wouldn't feel so supportive of it, or you wouldn't think this needs to you don't realize how much it needs to change, because you've not been educated about what's really going on. So that's where getting educated and seeing the options is the road to making those small changes. And like I said, Dan, people are overwhelmed. I understand that, and they've got so much going on. But just making small changes can make you feel better. Like it can be just incremental steps. Am I in a better situation than I was last week? Have I got one more contact who I know grows some food? And like you said, Dan, the idea we haven't got any time, we've all used that excuse. I've used it endlessly in my life.
Yeah.
But we know we've got time to watch, endless videos. We know we've got hours of that. So there is time. If you could substitute some of those videos for taking a little bit of action, sitting down, because it does take sitting down, focus. Maybe it's making a few calls and finding that person who's got a veg box and working that out. And but that's probably going to have more positive effect on your life than just consuming another video about a lot of things you already do know about. If you don't know about them, great, you need to learn about them. But I know it because I'm guilty of it myself. But I know about that topic, but I just want to get another hit of, into the weeds of it and look at it. And my excuse be sometimes I'm doing that as research for this podcast. But you can tell.
Yes.
I think it's your inner knowing, is it, Dan? You can tell when you're genuinely researching and getting more info that's going to help or you're actually just tuning in for some conspiratainment. And
yes.
And that you can be the barometer of where you are on that. We're all at a different stage, but there's definitely, you can look at yourself and am I distracting away from making some improvements in my own life or my local surroundings, and catch yourself and try and do more. And I'm speaking to the audience, but I'm speaking to myself.
Yes,
because that's we all have the same challenges of our mind getting in the way and our addictions and the distractions. So a lot of these calls are just reminders for everybody, and ourselves included, obviously.
Yeah, it comes down to the intention and the consciousness again. We know when we're down the rabbit hole and it's an automatic process, it's gone into like habitual. It's like with the coffee we're talking about. Like I'm here with my fancy tea, and I eliminated coffee fully for 2 to 3 weeks. But I have had a couple of intentional coffees, like not for habitual purposes, but because I actually wanted to try it and enjoy it. And it's very different to just having routine coffees. It's the same with just routinely reading the news. Like, is it done with a deliberate intent? Are you trying to learn something in particular or research? These are all questions we can ask ourselves. But ultimately, it comes back to, and I mentioned it in our last episode, the book that I'm reading at the minute, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman, asked the question, on average, we have 4,000 weeks to live. How would we constructively use those 4,000 weeks if that's all we have?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think it's good to collapse the time frame and say, if I only had 24 hours left or a week left, how would you be spending your time? And the shorter you collapse the time frame, you suddenly understand what's important. Because if you had 24 hours left, if you had an hour left, if you collapse it to an hour, like what would you do? You're probably going to tell your loved ones how much they mean to you. You'd fill your time with those things that really bring you joy. But because we have this like image that life will continue to last forever, that we don't make those important decisions, we always defer the things that are most important. Now, we don't have to collapse it down to an hour to 24 hours a week, but it is important to recognize that time is finite in terms of our existence in this physical realm at this time. Whatever your beliefs are that happens beyond that is down to you. But right now, like, are you making conscious choices that can make your life and the life of others better? And are you consciously choosing things that can actually improve the problems that you're concerned by? And that's something we have to ask ourselves every day. And when we do that in a way that kind of brings us joy and fulfillment, I really enjoy creating this content, and having these expansive conversations. It's, and I watch content and listen to content like this myself to help become informed, but I do so diligently to add value to my life, not to become consumed by someone else's negative ideas, regardless if it's independent media or mainstream media. It's trying to find something that is informative, educational, but empowering, because that's the key. That's the key to progress. And I think we'd all agree that it's time to move beyond all this clown world that we've touched upon and come back to a sense of sanity, but also bring a new energy to the world moving forward.
And the fuller we are ourselves, Dan, we sort of empty out the psyops and lies and then refill ourselves up with ourselves, then we're much more successful in life in everything we do, and we're much more engaging, and we're much things work better. So it is, and also the more filled are you up, and you can use lots of words. If people are full of light, it's very hard for darkness to get in. If you're full of your own path and what you're doing, it's very hard to be pushed off it by others or by by psyops. So again, coming back to yourself and filling that up as much as you can, that's a process, is what's going to lead to better personal growth and growth around you, and you being able to affect things you want to, like you said, Dan, try and improve, even if it's a tiny way, the problems you see in the world, even if it means you think there's a real lack of connection. I remember, again, I have to remind myself, there are times I completely fall out of it. One of the times I felt better is I see a lack of connection. Well, I need to, when I go out, make a little bit more connection with people. That's a tiny step, but I know how happy it makes me feel, rather than be lost in my head going, I could be on a walk through a park thinking no one's connected with anybody, no one, maybe sort of ranting to myself about why it is like that, but actually what's the change I could make? Well, I could breach that gap and try and make a connection. even if it's smiling at people, whatever. They're small things, but they are huge, aren't they? And yeah, that means that you're doing the work to try and be the change you want to see in the world, however
Definitely.
small it is.
Yes, that's what creates the ripple that becomes a wave. That's how we build a movement. That's how we create a counterculture, which is my current obsession. That's cool. Well, Sam, this has been another enlightening conversation. I think there's plenty of takeaways within this episode. I'm curious to know from our viewers and listeners' point of view, what's your takeaway? What's the one thing that you can do right now to simplify your life and to decentralize? Because this is about single steps that we can take when done repeatedly will actually create the impact. So let us know in the comments what your simple act of decentralization is going to be. It could be something locally. It could be, supporting your local food growers, whatever it is for you. Just tell us in the comments. It'd be really interesting to hear from you. And if you didn't know, Sam and I also have our Navigating the Financial Reset community, where we speak more frequently about these things with our support group that we've put together to help educate people around the kind of changing picture of the financial landscape, and also to help deepen people's knowledge of things like crypto and Bitcoin and how they can help create this kind of counter economics that we touched on today, but also to give you different options, to give you different, to diversify your own financial portfolios, to deepen your education. If you'd like to find out more about those types of things that we've got on offer right now, you can go to weareelevate.org/reset. So that's weareelevate.org/reset, and you'll see a couple of options that are available to you. You'll also see the full replay of our introduction to the financial reset, which is an hour and a half session, which is well worth watching in itself. So lots as always covered today, Sam. A beautiful conversation, and I think it's breaking those steps down to simple steps that anyone can take.
100%, Dan. For me, it's another call to action. We've seen the COVID clown world stuff start to ramp up, and I've been talking about it all summer. I expect financial things again to ramp up in the mainstream consciousness. They are massive things happening on the surface of financial markets as we speak all the time. They're papering over cracks. I can see massive creaks in the bond market recently this week. Dan, is what I've been looking into. The huge warning signs are there. Japan, absolutely huge quantitative easing. There's so much going on, and I'm not trying to give you a big financial macro picture here, but I want people to understand, get ahead of the curve, understand the tools you can use, diversify, decentralize, now, get moving, because it does take time to just learn the little skills and move things, but rather than waiting for another big catalyst, because it gets harder. I always talk about the Titanic going down, much harder if you're still on board whilst that pull of everything is going down. If you've got your life rafts out early and they're drifting away from that, sinking ship, then you've got loads of options and you're not sucked into that. And so you're moving ahead of time. And I think, likewise, Dan, whether it's, diversifying your assets, whether it's diversifying your where you get your food from, all these things are crucial with what's coming. And I don't mean that in a fear-based way. I just mean that's realistic. And, being able to pivot now, get ahead of the curve, you're going to feel better about yourself. And you're also going to be better prepared for whatever, and be creative with it and learn new skills. And again, give yourself a pat on the back because you're a pioneer. And we're all pioneers in this journey. And we can do good things if we get moving.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. And thank you to everyone who's watched today's episode. Please do hit the share button. Let us know your feedback. And look forward to our next episode of the Uncharted Territory podcast. And we'll see some of you within our next Navigating the Financial Reset call as well. So thanks very much for tuning in. We'll be back soon. And this episode, Sam, I think I might be on holiday when this is being recorded. We're ahead of the game.
We're ahead.
And I hopefully won't come back too sunburned. I'm going to take care of myself in beautiful Portugal. But I'll see you after the holiday on the very next episode of the Uncharted Territory podcast.